Okay, so this is a lecture video thing on the material science of mucus for a project for MSc 412. So first we're going to start by talking about viscoelasticity because that's an important property of mucus. So here we have viscous behavior, elastic behavior, and viscoelastic behavior. So viscous behavior can be modeled with this piston here. And basically, if you apply a constant stress to it, it has this time-dependent strain where it goes up as time increases because at first it doesn't stretch at all. It stretches as time goes on and you have the same force on it. For this elastic spring, when you apply a constant stress, you get a constant strain because it instantly is able to respond to that stress. For this viscoelastic thing, we use this Voigt model where you have a spring next to this piston and they are in series, so they experience the same exact strain because they're kind of like attached like this, so you can't have one straining more than the other. And basically what happens if you have this applied stress at time equals 0, all of the stress is in this piston and it can't move, so the strain is 0, but then as you get this time dependent response and it's able to move, it'll start moving, and the stress on this spring will increase because it's being stretched, so that'll make it move slower over time. So instead of just this linear response, you get this viscoelastic response that's kind of like a combination of these two. And most mucus is like, well, it's pretty much all viscoelastic. It's just sometimes those properties gets adjusted and fine-tuned, and sometimes that can lead to problems where you get like the pathophysiology of things, and sometimes it's just normal adjustments to just for different types of mucus in the body and stuff like that. Okay, so before we can get into actually talking about mucus, we have to talk about these different behaviors of fluids. So this is viscosity. It like dictates the behavior of this piston, and the viscosity is also the slope of this. So for a Newtonian fluid, it has the same viscosity regardless of the shear stress. So like even if you have higher shear stress, the viscosity is still the same. So the shear strain rate scales linearly with shear stress. For something that shear thickens, the viscosity increases with higher shear stress. So the shear strain rate won't increase by as much as it was increasing at lower shear stresses. And for shear thinning fluids, it does the opposite, where as the shear stress increases, the shear strain rate actually increases faster, like relative to how much shear stress is increasing. And mucus is a shear thinning fluid. We're going to get into like a teleological explanation of this instead of a mechanistic one, which has been discouraged in my physiology class, but this video is supposed to be more about material science, and I also don't understand the mechanisms as well because we haven't learned quite that much about that. Okay, so the reason that this is useful, which is, so let's say you have your lungs here, and you have mucus in them. You always have mucus in them. That's just how it works. And these are obviously not how lungs actually look, but this is a schematic diagram. Okay, so there's this mucus in it, and when you are coughing, this mucus experiences this higher shear this higher shear stress here. So at this higher shear stress, it loses some of the viscosity decreases, so it becomes easier to move this piston. So you are able to, it basically like is able to, so let's say you have some mucus down here, right, this piece, if you have this higher shear stress, it's able to behave more like something with a lower viscosity and go up there. But then once you stop coughing, like right after the cough, you wouldn't want it to drip back down immediately, which it would do if it had this constant like low viscosity. It would just also drip back down. You want it to stay there so then you can cough again and then it can come all the way out. That's kind of when you're sick though. Like normally your mucus, there's these cilia cells that constantly move the mucus upwards, right? It constantly gets moved upwards and then you swallow it. But when you're sick, like a lot of this mucus like builds up in here and you have to actually cough it out. And the shear thinning is important for that because the mucus is able to thin while you're coughing, but it doesn't but it is able to re-thicken when you stop coughing, so it doesn't just drip back down, because if it dripped back down, you would just end up with a bunch of like fluid stuck in here, and that would actually, so if you have an alveoli here, there's this capillary here, and there has to be gas transport between the two. That would impede the gas transport, and it would probably also interfere with the surfactants on it, which that's a whole other thing that is not quite as relevant to this. I accidentally deleted a clip that I needed because I'm bad at editing videos, so I have to kind of go back and explain this, what these components in mucus do for the mucus. So first there is mucins, which basically normally ignore all the green stuff because that's for later when I talk about what happens during COVID. Mucins are these glycoproteins, so this is protein, and then it has these like branched carbohydrate things coming off of it, so it's kind of like a branched copolymer sort of. And then you have DNA, and this is from this can be from like pathogens, or it can be your own DNA from your cells, and that gets increased during disease because your like immune cells and like white blood cells and your epithelial cells could all be like dying and like exploding their guts basically, and so these both cause the viscosity to increase. There's also lipids in your mucus, and that causes this viscosity to increase as well. There's ions, which actually cause a decrease in viscosity because it changes how these mucins interact with each other, like how the chains interact with each other. And then these proteins will increase the viscosity and the elasticity. Okay, before we actually talk about this, what changes during disease, I had this other interesting thing I learned about while looking through these research articles. So there's this macro rheology, like that we have been talking about, the like shear thinning and stuff. There's actually this microrheology as well. So when you have like the actual like micro scale things, it actually behaves differently than it does like macroscopically, I guess. So basically they've actually found that on the micro scale there's these like fibers of some of these like components, for example the mucins, and in between the fibers there's this fluid in a region, and this actually has very low viscosity here. So it kind of has like these different properties, and the way that they were able to figure this out, figure out how big the spacing is like between the fibers and stuff, is there's certain viruses of different sizes. So if you have a virus that's like bigger than this spacing, it'll diffuse through the mucus at the rate that shear will allow it to, so based on like what you would expect from the shear thinning behavior of the macrorheology. But if you have this really small virus, it's able to diffuse through much more quickly. So that's how they were able to find that like on the like micro scale the rheology is a little bit different, but that's not exactly relevant to what we're talking about next. I just thought it was really cool because I don't know, I haven't heard about macro and micro rheology before. Okay, so we kind of talked about how these things work and how they contribute to the viscoelastic properties of mucus, and now we can talk about how they change during COVID. So when you have COVID, the levels of mucins in your mucus can increase, decrease, or stay the same. It kind of depends on the patient. But the DNA levels increase, and the reason for that is because when you're fighting off a virus, some of your immune cells are dying. And it's also just killing your regular cells too, like your epithelial cells. It'll hijack it, explode, the cell dies, etc. So that causes this increase of buildup of DNA inside of your mucus. And then another thing they found was this hyaluronin, which is basically hyaluronic acid. And the other articles didn't mention it, so I think it's probably like a very small component of your mucus, but it gets increased by 10 times like when you have very severe COVID. So this viscosity increases by a ton, and you can even get like fibrosis, which is very bad because that's like scar tissue formation in your lungs, and you don't want that because that's just bad. Okay, and then so this large increase in viscosity causes problems for these patients with severe COVID. So normally what's happening in your lungs is your mucus, actually you don't need to be coughing it up because you have these cilia that will just move the mucus out, like it moves it up along here. These like, it's basically these hair cells, and they literally just go like that, and they go like that, like they just kind of like that. They literally just brush it along, basically. When you have like COVID or just some other respiratory illness, you'll be like coughing. So that allows the mucus to shear thin, as we talked about earlier, because the shear stress is increased on the mucus. It's able to shear thin and move up faster. And then it thickens again so that it doesn't just go back down due to gravity. So you want it to be shear thinning and not just always low viscosity. And then you're able to cough again, it'll shear thin again, move up, stay there, and then you can expel it. But when you have really severe COVID, this viscosity goes up by so much that even when you cough, this viscosity is so high that even if you use a really high shear stress, this strain rate still is not going to be super high. So it's not going to move that much or at all, and that's how mucus will get stuck in the lungs with someone with very severe COVID. And then you have, this is your alveoli, this is your capillary, that's where this like gas exchange is occurring. This mucus being here will kind of like create this extra barrier for diffusion, and it'll be harder for oxygen to diffuse from the alveoli to the capillary and for CO2 to diffuse from the capillary to the alveoli. And that's why you see people with COVID having like hypoxia and stuff. So yeah, that creates that problem. Now there's this drug called 4MU. Wait, let me double check that name because I might have put it in the wrong order. It might have been MU4. No, it is 4MU. So it's called 4MU. They have had drugs before to like modify the materials properties of this mucus in people with like severe COVID, where they use like they've thought about like drugs that like break down the DNA and the hyaluronic acid, but that's a little bit iffy because you don't want to just have a drug that breaks down DNA, because it can also break down your DNA and you don't want that. So if you have a drug, this drug called 4MU, it just breaks down the hyaluronic acid type thing by a lot, so it brings this viscosity back down to sort of a normalish level. You still have this elevated amount of DNA and elevated or just like change in mu, since we're kind of ignoring that because that can go down too. You still have this elevated DNA, but it's like making this overall somewhat less viscous, so it might still be harder to cough out, but it can still come out, and that's a better outcome for the patient. And they have like, sometimes they use these drugs with antivirals, and that's like effective obviously, but it's also effective without the antivirals too. So this just like independently modifying the materials properties of the mucus is helping improve the like prognosis of these patients with really severe COVID. But it does seem to be like more effective when it's also combined with antivirals, but that's, yeah. So that's an interesting application of the viscoelastic properties of mucus. Oh, also I forgot to say, this is just like a research article from like Stanford Medical School. It's not like they actually have this drug on the market. This is just like literally a phase 1 clinical trial, just as a disclaimer. Okay, these are the sources that I used for this, in addition to the notes from class and like some information from my physiology class as well.